Welcome to another presentation of Books at the Ukrainian Institute of America series. Today we would like to offer you a delightful book by Katya Cengel called From Chernobyl with Love, which is a report from the ruins of the Soviet Union that was published in 2018 by Potomac Books. In the late 1990s, Katya is a young, adventurous California girl set on exploring the exotic former republics of the Soviet Union and now independent countries, first Latvia and then Ukraine. With no previous knowledge of the regions, she boldly embarks on the heady, life-altering experience. Both Latvia and Ukraine, the same as the other successors of the former Soviet republics, are in the chaotic and unpredictable stage of transition from being convicts in the brutal totalitarian prison of nations, which was the Soviet Union, into independent, sovereign, and potentially democratic states. Katya and I share a surprisingly similar story. Both young and adventurous foreigners looking for excitement and knowledge, we were in Kiev around the same time. I happened to be there on a scholarship from the Jagiellon University in Krakow, taking courses at the Drahomanov University, and Katya was a staff writer at the expat English language newspaper Kyiv Post. Ukraine in the late 1990s was a fascinating country, a cultural and economic giant that was woken up from a long artificially induced sleep and now was stirring unsteadily, not sure where to turn and what to do. In addition, we were both hoping for love, and each of us found one. Kyiv was an exciting city during those days, grand in its topography and rich in architecture and culture, yet still not spoiled by the advancing rampart commercialism and greed. You had a huge Dnipro River, with its sandy beach islands cutting through the very middle of it, steep hills on its right bank, overgrown with purple blooming lilac bushes, golden domed churches towering above them, and vast open landscape stretching as far as the eye can see beyond it. But let's not be fooled. The book is not only about personal adventure. It goes deeply into the dramatic events that shape the political situation in Ukraine. The murder of Gongadze, freedom of speech, corruption, Orange Revolution, social unrest, as well as Chernobyl disaster and the terror attack on the other side of the Atlantic. After so many years of struggle, Ukraine is still a conflict zone, with the war within its border and occupied Crimea bursting with the Russian military on the south, and where journalists are not always free to speak their mind. It is not to be missed book, so please make sure to get one. It is available on Amazon or directly from the publisher. So let's now hear from Katya herself. Katya?
I wanted to share with you a few passages from Chernobyl with Love. First, I'll let you know that it actually recently won an IPI, that's an independent publisher's book award, as well as an Indies. And one of the passages I wanted to read was about Kiev and my impressions. And as probably most of you know, Kiev, very beautiful city. And the first time I saw it was in 1999. So this is quite a while ago. And I'd been living in Riga, Latvia before that. And so, and here I compare it to that. But the neighborhood where I lived was just a very special place, and it was a special time in my life. So I wanted to read a little excerpt from there. And then also one from, of course, it's called From Chernobyl with Love. For very main reason, that's where I met my fiance, was as a journalist while covering Chernobyl. Long after, about 15 years after the explosion. I didn't cover the explosion, this was later. So I will read an excerpt from there as well. So here's the first part about Kiev. Kiev was larger and more intimidating than Riga, and I had no one to help me explore it. My neighborhood was peaceful and beautiful, and for a while that was enough. A block from my door was a square-shaped park with old men playing chess at tree-shaded tables and an upscale restaurant where the waiters dressed as traditional Ukrainian Cossacks. At the other end of the park was a large statue of the man for whom it was named, Ukrainian poet and artist Taras Shevchenko. Not far behind my building was a wide tree-covered walkway that led directly to dome-topped Orthodox church from which the most beautiful singing could be heard. A pack of wild puppies hung out in the shrubbery en route to the botanical garden, which occupied part of the nearby hill. The entrance to the garden cost only a few kopecks, but the guards weren't very attentive. and I usually entered without paying. My place was within walking distance of 2 metro stops and several tram stops, all of which were cheap and semi-dependable. In time, I got to know the rest of the city, which was equally impressive. During Soviet times, Kiev was the 3rd largest city in the Union. When I moved there, it had a population of about 2,600,000. It had domed churches and modern nightclubs, fancy restaurants, and impressive old government buildings. One of Eastern Europe's oldest cities, Kiev is famous for St. Sophia Cathedral and the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, both recognized by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites. The locals know Kiev for Kreshadek, a main boulevard along which Maidan Nezalezhty, or Freedom Square, is located, as are many government buildings. On weekends and warm summer evenings, Kreshadek was closed to vehicles and music was blasted through public loudspeakers. Like a county fair, Kreshadek attracted families, couples, teenagers, and pensioners. I didn't explore much of this at first. Aside from Ewan, who already had a wife named Katya, my friend pool from which to find fellow explorers was limited. The expats at the paper were older and more settled than the Riga crowd. The local staff was shut off for other reasons. Our office manager, Vika, was friendly, but shy and unsure of herself around Americans. The female reporters included Katya, a small, serious blonde, Anya, an awkward young woman both physically and socially, and Genya. There were others, but they tended to come and go, and quite a few were on vacation that summer. Katya didn't seem to need any friends, and Anya was rather annoying. But Genya had a mixture of sweetness and ambition that both equaled my own, and later we would become friends. When it came to the local male staff, the majority didn't talk much to women. Vitaly did. With his dark hair, compact muscular build, and unflinching attitude, Vitaly couldn't easily be mistaken for a thug, until he smiled. And Vitaly, unlike the other men in the office, smiled at and laughed with women, treating them as an American man might, like friends and colleagues. A week or two into my stay, he stopped me as I walked by his desk. "What do you do outside of work?" he asked. I wasn't sure how to reply. Reading Ewan's science fiction books, even though I was not a science fiction fan, seemed almost as pitiful as watching old episodes of Alf dubbed into Russian, despite my having an almost physical aversion to the nasal-sounding actor who played the father on the show. I talked on the phone to my Italian-Austrian friend Sandra once or twice, but the connection was fuzzy, and I was guarded in what I told him. We had met when I was in London. He wanted to visit, but I wasn't sure where he fit in my life and didn't invite him. Although I was lonely, I'd gotten over my initial bout of misery. Greg had recently allowed me to do some of my own reporting. My first story on former collective farms had helped establish me as a serious writer. In the last issue, there had been a letter to the editor complimenting my writing. It was from Daniel, my old Canadian colleague and friend at the Baltic Times in Riga, Latvia. He had gone back to Canada, but was planning to move to Portugal to work for a wire service. I wasn't sure if all of this is what Vitaly wanted to hear when he asked what I did, so I kept it simple. "I read," I said. I thought maybe he would invite me to join him and Vika, whom he was dating, for a drink. He didn't. But then neither did any of my countrymen. Of course, I didn't drink, at least not then. That didn't happen until Chernobyl. So now I'm going to read a short part on Chernobyl. Actually, not the part where I get forced to drink homebrew vodka, which I guess is a thing now, but back when I went, 1999, not a lot of people went to the exclusion zone surrounding Chernobyl. And so I wanted to share a little excerpt from that. And it talks about some of my reporting and how I ended up reporting from the exclusion zone surrounding Chernobyl. Then I set about finding a way to visit Chernobyl. I discovered it wasn't that difficult to enter the exclusion zone that surrounded the plant. You just needed to know the right person. In my case, that person was Anatoly, a one-time documentary filmmaker who was from the region and thus had a special entrance pass. The zone was once home to 2 cities, Chernobyl and Pripyat, and 74 villages. In addition to receiving large doses of radiation after the disaster, those who lived in the zone were given shoddily constructed homes outside of it and passes that entitled them to special medical care and entrance back into the zone. I suppose accessing the zone had its advantages, especially when it came to bilking foreign journalists. Anatoly offered a number of services: translator, fixer, tour guide, for a price. Later, another fee was tacked on, a contamination tax for the value his vehicle would lose by being taken into the exclusion zone. Luckily, he did not demand a similar fee for his own exposure. I didn't like the way he did business, but I didn't see another option. This was before Chernobyl tours became a thing. I couldn't go to the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster with just anyone, and Anatoly knew what he was doing. At least I thought he did. On the drive there, he told me that the road had been repaved twice since the 1986 disaster in an attempt to reduce radiation. That wasn't because it had seen a huge amount of traffic. Buses stopped going to the area in 1986, and so did pretty much everyone else. There's no welcome sign announcing the entrance, just a military post where you hand over your documents. The soldier who took ours asked if I was scared. No, I lied. Good luck, he said. Seemed a strange thing to say, but then I suppose wanting to visit the zone was a strange thing to do. Living in it was even stranger and officially illegal, but that hadn't stopped a hardy troop of babushkas. Former residents of the area, they had hiked for miles with their belongings on their backs and slipped into the zone in the dark of night. Anatoly's late grandmother had been one of them, and he promised to introduce me to several others. Finding them was a challenge. From the single paved road that crosses the area, we saw only trees. An absence of street signs and people meant maps were useless and asking directions impossible. The side roads were unpaved and so overgrown with vegetation, it was a rare treat to actually spot a roof, wall, or shop sign. Trees sprouted in what were once entranceways. Brambles peeked out from paneless windows, and birds nested in cracked concrete stairwells. A modern community abandoned to time and nature, the place was quiet and creepy in a way an occupied village or empty countryside can never be. When I exited the car, Anatoly warned me to stay on the pavement. The grass and moss had higher levels of radiation, he said. After the accident, Chernobyl was closed off. The phone lines were cut and no one was allowed to enter or leave. Evacuations began 3 days after the accident, and it continued for 2 weeks. Residents were told they would be able to return in a few days. They were never allowed back. But as time passed, several hundred former residents, mostly elderly, returned. Chernobyl was their home, and outside of it, they had never felt comfortable. Probably didn't help that the secrecy surrounding the accident meant outsiders treated them with a mixture of jealousy and fear, envying them their special status, while at the same time shunning their presence in case contamination was contagious. If you look carefully, you can spot signs of their existence: a shadowy figure or laundry hanging out to dry in a wheat field. Galina's door was open, her garden neat and orderly. She was one of the babushkas Anatoly introduced me to. She returned a year after the accident, when the home where she had been relocated broke in two during the spring thaw. In 1992, a fire almost destroyed her Chernobyl home. There were no firefighters to help her put it out. One winter, she spent a month without electricity. The summer I visited, there was no running water. A serious situation for those who are exposed to radiation and are advised to shower daily. At the time, a supply bus visited the zone twice a week. But in the beginning, residents were completely cut off, and they learned to rely on the land, drinking milk from their cows and eating fish from the lakes and fruits and vegetables from their gardens. They did not seem bothered by the fact that radiation levels in dirt and marine animals were still 100 times more than normal 10 years after the accident. Like any good Ukrainian hostess, Galina did not wait to offer me food. I tried the "I'm not hungry" tactic, knowing it wouldn't work and I would be obliged to eat the blintzes. She was proud that they were stuffed with fruit from her own garden, and I might have shared the sentiment had her garden not been on soil surrounding the world's worst nuclear disaster. Calculating that a babushka's displeasure lasts longer than the effects of radiation, I gingerly sliced into a blueberry blintz. as I ate, I tried not to think about the fact that radioactive elements are decreasing faster in undisturbed forested state lands than in private lands that are being farmed. The blintz was actually quite tasty. I'm going to end it there. She does then make me, no, it's the next woman who makes me drink her homebrewed vodka, which was when you don't drink 3 o'clock in the afternoon, homebrewed Chernobyl vodka. Quite an adventure. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Katya, for the reading and for joining us. There are a few questions that I wanted to ask you, so we'll have a brief Q&A session. First, I wanted to ask you about your name. Someone seeing Katya on the cover of a book about Ukraine, it's up to assume the author is of Ukrainian origin. As I understand it, this is not so, nor are you of Slavic origin at all. Is that right?
The name, I do have some Slavic, but no Ukrainian at all. And so it was funny, when I was in Ukraine, it was the first time I heard Katya on the street all the time, because there's so many Katyas, where in the US I never heard it. And so I'd turn and be like, oh, is that me? And then people would hear my name and they'd be like, oh, your English is so good. Well, you have to hear my Ukrainian in Russian, which is not so good. What happened, I'm born in California, both parents American, but my dad is full-blooded Slovak. So he grew up in outside Chicago in a very Slovak neighborhood. I think he had a high school picture where the lone kid that wasn't Slovak was from Croatia. So it was a very kind of insular community, and he grew up speaking some Slovak. And so my mom thought, because my last name Cengel's a little strange, that she wanted to give me a Slovak name. But my dad's parents, being more the generation, they wanted me to be very American. So they wouldn't help with Slovak names. So my mom got out the Russian English dictionary and just decided to choose a name and settled on Katya.
Wonderful.
So now, since the mystery of your name has been solved, I wanted us to talk about your experience of visiting Chernobyl. It couldn't have been an easy trip for you at the time when everything was still raw, covered in secrecy, and not much spoken about, and where its few residents tried to continue with their lives as if nothing had happened. Chernobyl is an unusual icon which lives on in popular culture and tourist attractions where tour guides are making a living on those seeking excitement. It astonished me that Chernobyl tours were promoted at the New York Times travel show as a top Ukrainian attraction. It was a place of the biggest nuclear disaster the world has ever known, grave for both people and environment, the consequences of which we will suffer for decades to come. How do you feel about it from the perspective of time? Would you go and organize a tour to Chernobyl now?
It's so strange to see that yet. And it seems this year, I think because of the Chernobyl HBO series, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, I think Economist, like every big publication has sent a reporter or they've written about going to Chernobyl on these tours. And it's so hard to believe for me, because when I went, I guess it was the first time, it was less than 15 years after the explosion. And so it wasn't right after. But even journalists weren't really going then. It was scientists, and it was very difficult to go. You had to get special permission, and there was still a lot of fear. I remember the photographer I wanted to take with me, who was Ukrainian, his girlfriend did not want me to take him. She kept saying, please don't take Victor, because she was worried about what might happen in their, if they stayed together and had children later. And it was actually a big thing. But I thought it was his choice whether he wanted to go or not. And he decided he wanted to go. But yeah, when we went, there was, I don't want to say we had it to ourselves. There were some scientists, and we had someone who had a pass. He had grown up in Chernobyl, so he had a pass so he could get in. But without that, you couldn't get in. So they've obviously changed things a lot, that they have these tours. And it was weird. I was reading the tours. They take them to this house and they see the local people have moved back there. And that was one of the things that had first interested me about the exclusion zone, was the mostly older former residents who had come back in on their own going against regulation and enduring without, I think, one woman, at first there was no water service, there was no services at that time. So it was really a daring thing to do, but they really felt that was home. And I think, I also read one of those articles now, people are posing things for photos, they're leaving dolls at the exclusion zone and things. And so it's very strange to hear that. I think, especially as a journalist, I have trouble when you're putting something in the photo that wasn't there before and pretending I mean, I know they're not journalists going now, they're tourists and things, but that's just strange, like this fake recreation almost. But then again, I guess it's nice that they're able to make some money out of this. And it's, I think Ukrainians have a great sense of humor, but also a great kind of entrepreneurial aspect to them. And so I don't know if some other countries would do something like that, but I think Ukrainians are great about seeing an opportunity. And if people want to pay money to do this, and there's a story to tell, and the good thing is, I think too, it does still tell some of the stories of Chernobyl. It's different now. It's kind of obviously been Hollywoodized in some other things and posed and such, but I think it is reminding people what happened, and that I'd be interested to hear more though from survivors, their perspective, not the ones who have gone back to live there, or not ones who are doing the tourism or that, but some outside, and maybe focusing on, when I was there, they were supposed to have free medical benefits, all these kind of things, but a lot of it they weren't getting. So it would be interesting to see if they're benefiting in any way from any of this. That would be nice if it could be helping them, because I know that was, and also telling more of the full story. I think people forget the other two reactors kept going for quite a while afterwards, and the people who had jobs there. And so getting the bigger picture and how people were resettled afterwards, the different communities that, I think that was interesting for me when I did some other stories. I visited Chernobyl 3 or 4 times, but I also did stories about some of the people who had lived in Chernobyl and where they'd been resettled. And I remember there was one town that had been really close, somewhere in the exclusion zone, and the people got separated into different villages and towns because those different villages and towns didn't want certain people, didn't need that many people, and it really destroyed the sense of community, and they had a lot of trouble being accepted in the new communities and things. So there's so much more to the story, and I do fear with some of the tours and things you're getting a very simplified version, but again, hopefully it'll get people to want to explore more in depth the story.
Thank you. And another question as a follow-up to my previous one. You have never been back to Ukraine. Do you still feel nostalgia for it? Do you follow it in the news? Ukraine is still a conflict zone and not a promised land flowing with milk and honey. How do you see its current situation?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a part of me that definitely wants to go. I definitely follow news and those events, but it's hard for me to picture. I think part of me doesn't want to go back because I have this it was a difficult time when I was there. Definitely a lot of people were struggling, but it also, for me, because I was young then, it was a beautiful time in my life, where I was learning about myself, learning about a country. People were there weren't, outside of Kiev, there weren't as many Americans that had visited at that time. So everyone was really friendly to me. And I don't know, now I know a lot more. You still had to get a visa if you were an American to go there. Now you don't have to do that. And I know there's a lot more Americans going. And so I don't know how, hopefully they still like Americans, but I mean, I just it was a special time. And maybe that was just, as I said, because I was young then. So it was a special time in my life, but it was also, I felt it was a mix of, there was a lot of struggle in Ukraine, but there was also hope. And in some ways there's still a lot of struggle there. And I hope, I've been following there was a woman who was in the book actually, who I worked with. She was a journalist. She was an intern at the Kiev Post when I was there, and she's now over there and she writes for the LA Times. And so I always follow her coverage on Ukraine because I think she does a really good job. She has such a connection, has been around Ukraine for so long. And she adds, because Ukraine started getting in the news again recently, and some of the stories, the focus is on the American version or Russian version, and you don't hear the Ukrainian side as much. So I thought she did a good job of trying to tell a Ukrainian story and really focusing on the younger people and how a group of them are really trying to change things and the hope they have. And so that was really encouraging. I don't know any of those young people. It's been too long since I was there, but I like reading her stories and seeing some of that and seeing some of that hope again, even with all the struggles. And I have this picture that I've talked to some friends since I remember, and there was traffic, but it wasn't that bad. And I've heard like where one of the offices I worked was, now it's like you can't even get past, traffic is so bad and it's really expensive, and it was pretty affordable when I was there to live. I had a really nice apartment, and so I think a lot of that though is age. Everything looks better when you're in your early 20s.
Exactly, I agree with that.
What one final point about the book would you like to make?
I think for me, it was because I wasn't Ukrainian, and I grew up in the U.S. with the name Katya, though, which always kind of helped me be interested in. And I grew up at a time when there was the Soviet Union, and it was just this kind of closed off area, and so I was always kind of curious. And I think after things opened up, there was kind of this mixing of ideas and people, and it was interesting because it was a time when you couldn't as easily communicate. I went over there and I remember there was no Skype. There were the phone, email, I think internet. I didn't have internet in my apartment, so I'd email. I could only get it at the office, so I couldn't communicate with family on the weekends and things. And so I think it was a really interesting time to be abroad. And I think I teach now journalism part-time, and I always try and tell my students, I think it's a great experience when you're young to go over to a place and learn about a place. And I think I remember you saying that your time in Ukraine changed you, and I think it definitely changed me. And I think the stories I wanted to tell too, though, it was a bit my story, but I just used that to be able to tell the stories of the people I met there, and some of the stories I was able to record, like a survivor of the artificial famine. I mean, people who now probably are not living anymore, but some of the stories that you couldn't get. And I remember they were still scared to talk to me even when I was there. And they hadn't even, while Stalin was alive, they couldn't talk. And then even after Stalin, just during Soviet times, they were still scared to tell their stories. So I thought it was really important to try and get some of those stories and document and give people a fuller picture of Ukraine in that time. I think a lot of people also think that when everything fell apart and collapsed, that everything just miraculously worked or something. They forget there were these really hard, difficult years for a lot of countries, and kind of their creative ways people came with to deal with that. And I think also, sorry, there are a lot of things I want people to get apparently.
That's okay. That's okay.
I think the last thing is the Ukrainians were so nice to me, so accepting, so curious, open, friendly, but also I love the sense of humor. I think humor in difficult times is just in this sense. I appreciate it. In the book, I use that. I try and use some of that humor, and I think now we've got difficult times again and everywhere. I think obviously you don't want to use it wrong, but I think it is important to laugh at ourselves when we can, or try and see the absurdity in some things, and just to adapt. I think Ukrainians also did a great job adapting.
Thank you, Katya, so much. We really appreciate your time, and I hope we can meet again soon. The book is available on the Amazon or directly from the publisher. And also, please make sure to follow Katya and the Ukrainian Institute of America on our social media platforms. Thank you. Until then.
Thank you so much.